The moment he saw his ex-wife walk into the wedding, he thought she was the guest. He had no idea she was the reason everyone else looked nervous. The late afternoon sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold as luxury SUVs lined the curved entrance of the Sterling Ridge Resort. Ballas moved quickly beneath towering palm trees, and soft piano music drifted from the ballroom overlooking the mountains. It was supposed to be one of the happiest weddings of the season. At least, that was what Ethan Brooks believed. He stepped out of a black Mercedes, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit while cameras flashed near the entrance. Beside him stood Madison Reed, his fiancée, elegant and smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Together they looked exactly like the image Ethan wanted the world to see. Successful. Polished. Untouchable. Ethan glanced toward the grand ballroom and felt a familiar satisfaction settle inside him. Years ago, he had imagined arriving at a place like this with Eva Johnson by his side. But life had changed. Or at least, that was the story he preferred to tell. Quite a place, Madison said as she looked up at the sprawling resort. Isn't it market? The kind of place people spend their whole lives trying to get invited to. Around them, guests in designer dresses and custom suits mingled beneath crystal chandeliers visible through the glass walls. Every detail radiated wealth. Every corner seemed designed to remind people exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy. Ethan enjoyed that feeling. He always had. As they approached the entrance, a few familiar faces greeted him. Investors. Executives. Business owners. People who once ignored his calls now shook his hand with enthusiasm. Ethan accepted every compliment with practiced confidence. Everything was unfolding exactly as he expected. Then something changed. It was subtle at first. A shift in attention. A ripple moving quietly through the crowd. Conversations paused. Heads turned toward the driveway. Even the wedding coordinator standing near the entrance stopped speaking mid-sentence. Ethan frowned slightly and followed their gaze. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop. Beneath the covered entrance. The vehicle itself wasn't unusual. At a place like this, luxury was expected. But the reaction around him was. Several staff members straightened immediately. A hotel manager appeared from inside the building and moved toward the entrance with unusual urgency. Ethan watched as the rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped out. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. The sunlight caught the emerald fabric of her gown as it moved gently in the desert breeze. Her posture was calm. Her expression unreadable. She looked neither impressed nor intimidated by the luxury surrounding her. A tense smile disappeared. Because the woman standing beneath the golden evening sky was Eva Johnson. His ex-wife. A person can spend years convincing themselves they made the right choice, only to have one unexpected moment force them to question everything. Ethan stood frozen for a second longer than he intended. Around him, conversation slowly resumed, glasses clinked, and soft music drifted through the warm desert air, but his attention remained fixed on Eva. 5 years. That was how long it had been since he had last seen her in person. 5 years since a judge finalized the paperwork. 5 years since she packed the last box and walked out of the house they once shared. Back then, she had looked exhausted. Not weak. Used, tired. Tired from carrying responsibilities nobody noticed. Tired from supporting dreams that seemed to belong to everyone except herself. The woman standing beneath the entrance canopy looked nothing like the person he remembered. Eva moved with quiet confidence as she accepted a greeting from the hotel manager. She did not rush. She did not look around for approval. She simply walked forward as if she belonged wherever she chose to stand. Madison noticed the change in Ethan's expression. "That is your ex-wife?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "I almost did not recognize her." Madison studied Eva for a moment. "She looks good." Ethan immediately looked away. People change. But the truth unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Because Eva had not changed overnight. Whatever stood before him now had been built over years he knew nothing about. Years he had never cared enough to ask about. Once upon a time, Eva had been the first person awake every morning. Ethan remembered the small apartment they rented when money was tight. He remembered her leaving before sunrise to make it to work. He remembered her returning late at night and still helping him prepare presentations for meetings that could determine his future. She had believed in his ambitions even when nobody else did. There had been nights when she sat at the kitchen table reviewing spreadsheets while he practiced investor pitches. There had been weekends sacrificed to business plans and networking events. At the time, Ethan convinced himself they were building a future together. Then success arrived. Slowly at first. Then all at once. New opportunities appeared. Bigger contracts followed. More influential people entered his world. Somewhere along the way, gratitude became entitlement. Conversations became shorter. Dinners became business meetings. Promises became delays. And eventually, Eva became part of a chapter Ethan no longer wanted included in the story he was telling himself. Madison entered his life during that period. Younger. Ambitious. Comfortable in the social circles Ethan was beginning to value more than the people who helped him reach them. The divorce had not been dramatic. In some ways, that made it worse. There had been no shouting. No scene. Used silence. The kind of silence that settles over something already broken. Ethan remembered the last time Eva stood in front of him before signing the papers. She had looked at him for several seconds. Then she simply nodded, as if accepting something she could no longer change. He expected anger. He expected blame. Instead, she walked away with dignity he never fully understood. Now, standing outside one of the most exclusive resorts in Arizona, Ethan watched her climb the front steps toward the ballroom entrance. Several guests turned to look at her. Not because she demanded attention. Because she naturally drew it. Then something else caught his eye. The rear passenger door of the SUV remained open. Someone else was stepping out. A tall man in a charcoal suit emerged from the vehicle with calm, effortless confidence. He closed the door himself, adjusted his cuff, and began walking toward Eva. Within seconds, the expressions of several staff members changed again. And for the first time that evening, Ethan felt a small, unfamiliar sense of unease settle quietly into his chest. So many people announce their importance the moment they enter a room. Others never need to. Ethan watched the man approach Eva and immediately tried to place him. He was tall, perhaps a little over 6 feet, dressed in a charcoal gray suit tailored with understated precision. No flashy watch. No visible security detail. No attempt to draw attention. Yet the attention seemed to follow him anyway. The strange part was not the man himself. It was the reaction around him. A senior manager from the resort moved toward him with a level of respect Ethan normally associated with major investors or celebrity guests. 2 staff members who had been speaking near the entrance suddenly stepped aside to clear his path. Even the wedding coordinator appeared noticeably more alert. The man reached Eva and offered a small smile. She returned it. No dramatic display. No performance. Used the quiet familiarity that suggested trust built over time rather than excitement created for an audience. Ethan felt Madison glance toward him. Do you know who he is? She asked. No, Ethan replied. Never seen him before. The answer bothered him more than he expected. Ethan knew people. Building relationships had become second nature over the years. He could usually identify someone's status within minutes. But this man did not fit any category he recognized. They entered the ballroom together. Eva walked beside him, not behind him. Not ahead of him. Beside him. Somehow that detail stayed with Ethan. Inside, the ballroom glowed beneath enormous crystal chandeliers suspended nearly 30 feet above polished marble floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the desert mountains in the distance while hundreds of guests settled into elegant conversations before the ceremony. Waiters moved through the room carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. A string quartet performed softly near the center of the hall. Ethan had attended events like this for years. He understood social dynamics. He understood hierarchy. And yet, as he watched Eva and the stranger move through the crowd, something felt different. They were not introducing themselves. People were approaching them. One guest stopped to greet them. Tena note. Tena note. Not with excitement. With respect. The distinction mattered. Madison noticed it too. That seems unusual, she said quietly. Ethan forced a small laugh. Maybe he works with the family. But even as he said it, he did not believe it. Across the ballroom, Eva appeared completely at ease. She accepted greetings with calm confidence. There was no effort to impress anyone. No attempt to prove anything. Ethan suddenly remembered a conversation from years earlier. It had happened late one evening in their kitchen. He had been frustrated about a business setback. Ava listened quietly before saying something he dismissed at the time. She told him that truly successful people rarely spent energy convincing others they were successful. Back then, Ethan thought it sounded idealistic. Standing in the ballroom now, he found himself remembering every word. His attention returned to the stranger just as an elderly man in an expensive tailored suit crossed the room to greet him. Ethan immediately recognized the man. Richard Langford. A real estate developer whose company owned billions of dollars in commercial property across the Southwest. Ethan had spent months trying to secure a meeting with him 2 years earlier. The meeting never happened. Yet now Richard Langford was smiling warmly as he shook the stranger's hand. Not as an equal seeking a favor. As someone genuinely pleased to see him. Ethan's stomach tightened. For the first time that evening, he stopped wondering whether the man was important. The real question was how important. And why nobody seemed willing to say his name. The people who rebuilt themselves rarely talk about the years it took to do it. They simply arrive one day as someone the world no longer recognizes. Ethan continued watching from across the ballroom, but his attention gradually drifted away from the guests and settled entirely on Eva. The ceremony was still nearly 30 minutes away. Conversations filled the room. Laughter echoed softly beneath the chandeliers. Yet for Ethan, the noise seemed distant. Because the more he observed Eva, the more he realized how little he knew about the life she had built after leaving him. 5 years earlier, after the divorce was finalized, Eva had quietly disappeared from the circles they once shared. At first, Ethan assumed she would eventually reach out. Maybe to ask for help. Maybe to reconnect with mutual friends. Maybe to explain what she planned to do next. She never did. Months passed. 10 years. Occasionally he heard fragments through old acquaintances. Someone mentioned she had moved to another city. Another person claimed she was working in nonprofit development. Someone else thought she had started consulting. The stories never matched, and eventually Ethan stopped paying attention. At last, that was what he told himself. The truth was simpler. He assumed she would always remain a chapter he had already finished reading. What he never saw were the mornings before sunrise. The small apartment overlooking a crowded downtown street. The endless hours spent rebuilding a career from the ground up. The networking events where nobody knew her name. The professional certifications earned one course at a time. The lonely weekends invested in projects that offered no guarantees. Ava never posted motivational speeches online. She never announced a comeback. She simply worked. While Ethan focused on maintaining an image of success, Eva focused on becoming someone stronger than the person who needed validation. Somewhere during those years, she learned an important lesson. Luz could either become an identity or a teacher. She chose the second. Across the ballroom, she stood near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the desert landscape. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold. The man beside her listened as she spoke, occasionally smiling. Whatever they discussed seemed effortless. Comfortable. Real. Ethan suddenly realized something that unsettled him. Ava was not performing for anyone. She was not trying to make him jealous. She was not scanning the room to see if people noticed her. In fact, she had not looked in his direction even once. Madison followed his gaze. "You are staring," she said quietly. Ethan immediately picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. "I am just curious." Madison did not respond. She knew him well enough to recognize when curiosity was hiding something else. Meanwhile, near the ballroom entrance, another group of guests approached Ava and the stranger. One of them was a nationally recognized attorney whose face appeared regularly in business publications. Another was a technology founder who had recently sold his company for hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan recognized both men instantly. What he did not understand was why they seemed eager to greet someone whose name remained a mystery. The stranger exchanged handshakes. Ava smiled politely. The interactions were brief but meaningful. Nobody treated them like ordinary guests. Nobody treated them like outsiders. It was almost as if they belonged to a world operating quietly beneath the surface of the one everyone else could see. Then Ethan noticed something else. Near the front of the ballroom, two event coordinators were reviewing last-minute details. One of them pointed discreetly toward the stranger. The other immediately nodded and adjusted several items on her tablet before speaking into a headset. Whatever instruction had just been given, it appeared important. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. For the third time that evening, he found himself asking the same question. Who exactly was the man standing beside Ava? And why did it seem like the entire resort was preparing itself around his presence? The most important people in a room are often the ones nobody introduces because everyone assumes they already know who they are. Ethan tried to focus on the upcoming ceremony, but his attention kept returning to the same corner of the ballroom. Ava and the mysterious man had moved toward a quieter section near the windows, where the fading sunlight painted long golden reflections across the marble floor. Neither of them appeared concerned about the attention they were attracting. They were simply talking. Occasionally smiling. Completely unaffected by the curiosity building around them. That confidence bothered Ethan more than he wanted to admit. Confidence without effort was something money could not easily buy. A few minutes later, guests began taking their seats as wedding staff guided people toward the ceremony area. Rows of elegant white chairs faced a floral arch positioned against a breathtaking view of the Arizona mountains. The atmosphere shifted from casual conversation to anticipation. Yet even during the transition, Ethan noticed something unusual. Several members of the resort staff seemed to be receiving instructions through their earpieces. Their eyes repeatedly drifted toward the same individual. The stranger standing beside Ava. One coordinator adjusted seating arrangements. Another quietly spoke with security personnel stationed near the ballroom entrance. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Used a series of small decisions that appeared connected to a person nobody was officially acknowledging. Madison leaned closer. This is getting strange. Ethan forced a smile. You are imagining things. But he knew she was not. Across the room, Ava turned slightly and looked toward the mountains beyond the glass. For a brief moment, she seemed lost in thought. Ethan unexpectedly remembered another version of her. The woman who used to stop whatever she was doing whenever she saw a beautiful sunset. The woman who believed success meant having enough peace to enjoy simple moments. Back then, he thought those ideas sounded naive. Now, watching her standing calmly in a room filled with wealth and influence, he wondered whether she had understood something he never had. A burst of laughter near the front of the ballroom pulled him back to the present. Several prominent guests had gathered around the stranger. Ethan recognized nearly every face in the group. Corporate executives. Investors. Industry leaders. Men and women whose calendars were booked months in advance. Yet their body language felt different. They were not networking. They were listening. The stranger spoke briefly. The group smiled. Then one by one, they moved away. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Whoever this man was, people respected him without him asking for it. The distinction was impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the senior event directors hurried across the ballroom carrying a tablet. She approached the stranger directly. Ethan expected a quick conversation. Instead, the director stopped, smiled politely, and handed him the device. The man reviewed something on the screen for several seconds. Then he nodded once. Only once. The director immediately thanked him and walked away. Not the other way around. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Resort executives did not seek approval from ordinary guests. Around the ballroom, the lights dimmed slightly as the ceremony prepared to begin. Music softened. Conversations faded. Guests settled into their seats. Yet Ethan barely noticed any of it. Because for the first time all evening, a thought entered his mind that he could not dismiss. What if the man beside Eva was not simply important? What if he was the reason this entire place seemed to move the way it did? There is a moment before the truth arrives when people sense it without understanding it. Ethan felt that moment settling over the ballroom like a shadow stretching across sunlight. The ceremony was supposed to begin in minutes. Guests adjusted in their seats. The string quartet transitioned into a softer arrangement. Beyond the towering windows, the Arizona sky glowed with deep orange and crimson hues as the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Everything appeared perfect. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that something important was happening just beyond his understanding. Ava and the mysterious men finally took their seats several rows ahead. Not in the center. Not in the front. They chose positions that attracted less attention rather than more. That decision confused Ethan even further. Most influential people preferred visibility. They preferred recognition. These men seemed completely indifferent to both. Madison folded her hands in her lap and quietly observed the room. "Have you noticed something?" she asked. Ethan looked. "Thou work here." "What?" "Nobody is introducing themselves to him anymore." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Madison glanced toward the guests scattered throughout the ballroom. Earlier everyone was walking over to greet him. Now they are keeping their distance. Ethan studied the room and slowly realized she was right. People still looked toward the stranger occasionally. But they were no longer approaching him. It was as if some invisible boundary had formed around him. Not out of fear. Out of respect. The distinction made Ethan increasingly uncomfortable. Near the floral arch, wedding coordinators moved efficiently through final preparations. A microphone was tested. Lighting adjustments were completed. Several members of the resort management team gathered near the side entrance. Ethan noticed one detail immediately. The general manager himself had joined them. Someone in his position rarely handled ceremony logistics personally. Yet there he stood, reviewing information on a tablet while occasionally glancing toward the audience. Specifically toward Eva and the man beside her. Then something unexpected happened. One of the coordinators hurried across the ballroom carrying a folder. She approached the general manager and spoke quietly. His expression changed almost instantly. Not panic. Not concern. More like sudden realization. He immediately turned toward the audience and scanned the rows of seated guests. Several seconds later, his gaze landed on the stranger. The manager nodded once before speaking into a headset. Within moments, additional staff members began moving discreetly throughout the venue. Ethan sat forward in his chair. Madison noticed. "What now?" she whispered. "I do not know," Ethan admitted. For the first time all evening, that answer felt honest. Across the ballroom, Eva remained completely calm. She did not appear surprised by any of the activity unfolding around her. The stranger beside her remained equally composed. His attention was fixed on the ceremony program resting in his hands. It looked like a man waiting for an ordinary event to begin. Yet everything around him suggested there was nothing ordinary about his presence. Aló. Murmur suddenly spread through the crowd. Guests exchanged confused looks. Several people checked their phones. Others glanced toward the entrance. Ethan followed their attention and noticed 3 black SUVs arriving outside the main ballroom windows. They parked near the private entrance reserved for executives and special guests. A few seconds later, the general manager straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and began walking directly toward the stage. Whatever was about to happen had clearly not been part of the original wedding schedule. Truce rarely arrives with noise. More often, it enters quietly and waits for everyone else to notice. The low murmur spreading through the ballroom gradually faded as the general manager stepped onto the stage. His appearance alone was enough to capture attention. This was not part of the wedding program. Guests exchanged curious glances. Several people looked toward the ceremony entrance, expecting the wedding party to appear. Instead, the general manager adjusted the microphone and offered an apologetic smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and professional, "thank you for your patience. Before we begin this evening's ceremony, there is a brief matter that requires acknowledgement." The room became still. Ethan exchanged a confused look with Madison. Nobody seemed to understand what was happening. Near the front rows, even members of the wedding party appeared surprised. The general manager continued. "As many of you know, Sterling Ridge Resort recently completed an extensive expansion project that transformed this property into one of the premier luxury destinations in the Southwest." Several guests nodded politely. Others listened with growing curiosity. "What many people do not know," he continued, "is that this project would not have been possible without the vision and leadership of the individual whose investment group acquired and redeveloped this property several years ago." Ethan felt a subtle shift ripple through the audience. The words themselves were harmless. Yet something about the manager's tone suggested this was leading somewhere important. "This evening," he said, "we are honored by his presence." A few guests turned instinctively toward the front of the room. Others glanced toward the entrance. The general manager smiled. "On behalf of everyone at Sterling Ridge Resort, I would like to personally recognize our owner and chairman." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Nearby conversation stopped completely. The manager looked directly toward the audience seating area. "Thou wert Abba. Thou wert the man sitting beside her. Mr. Alexander Sterling." For a brief second, nobody moved. The name seemed to hang suspended in the air. Then reality caught up. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. Several guests immediately turned in their seats. Others straightened with visible surprise. A woman near the aisle covered her mouth. One of the executives Ethan recognized looked almost relieved, as though a mystery had finally been solved. Ethan remained frozen. Alexander Sterling. The name struck him like a memory he could not immediately place. Then it came rushing back. Business journals. Financial publications. Interviews. Investment conferences. Alexander Sterling was not merely wealthy. He was one of the most influential private investors in the country. His companies owned commercial developments, technology ventures, luxury properties, and infrastructure projects worth billions of dollars. Ethan had spent years reading about deals associated with the Sterling name. He had once attempted to attend an industry event hoping for an introduction. The opportunity never happened. Yet now, sitting less than 30 feet away, was the man himself. The ballroom erupted into applause. Alexander stood slowly and acknowledged the crowd with a modest nod. No speech. No performance. No attempt to draw attention to himself. The reaction alone said everything. Then Ethan noticed something far more shocking. As Alexander stood, he extended his hand naturally toward Eva. She accepted it without hesitation. The gesture lasted only a moment. Simple. Familiar. Effortless. But in that instant, Ethan finally understood what nobody had needed to explain. Ava was not standing beside a billionaire because she happened to know him. She was standing beside him because she belonged there. Sometimes the most painful realization is not that someone moved on. It is discovering how far they moved while you were not paying attention. The applause gradually faded as Alexander returned to his seat beside Eva. The ceremony coordinator resumed her position. The string quartet began playing again. To most people, the interruption had ended. To Ethan, it felt like everything had just begun. He sat motionless, staring ahead while fragments of information collided inside his mind. Alexander Sterling. Owner of the resort. Founder of a multi-billion-dollar investment group. One of the most influential businessmen in the country. A man whose companies appeared regularly in financial headlines and whose projects shaped entire cities. Ethan knew exactly who he was now. What he could not understand was how Eva had become part of that world. Madison finally broke the silence. Alexander Sterling, she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes. The Alexander Sterling? Ethan swallowed. There is only one. Around them, guests quietly discussed the revelation. Some seemed surprised. Others appeared amused, as though they had known the truth all along and simply enjoyed watching everyone else catch up. A few people discreetly glanced toward Eva. Not with curiosity. With admiration. Ethan noticed every look. Every smile. Every subtle gesture. The room had changed. Earlier, he assumed Eva was attending as an unexpected guest. Now it was impossible to ignore reality. She occupied a social position beyond anything he had imagined. As preparations resumed, an older gentleman seated nearby leaned toward another guest. Ethan overheard only part of the conversation. They have been married for nearly 2 years now, the man said quietly. The words struck Ethan harder than he expected. Married. Not dating. Not engaged. Married. For reasons he could not explain, hearing it spoken aloud made everything feel more real. He looked toward Eva again. She listened attentively as Alexander said something to her. She smiled softly before looking toward the front of the ballroom. No dramatic affection. No performance. Just the comfort of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Ethan suddenly realized he had spent years measuring success through visibility. Through titles. Through invitations. Through people recognizing his name. Yet the relationship unfolding in front of him seemed built on something entirely different. There was no need to impress anyone because neither of them appeared concerned with being impressive. Madison shifted slightly beside him. Did you know she remarried? Ethan hesitated. No, the answer felt embarrassing. Not because Eva owed him information. Because he realized how little effort he had ever made to understand what happened after she left. In his mind, she had remained frozen in the past. The woman standing in a quiet kitchen helping him build presentations. The woman carrying responsibilities nobody noticed. The woman whose future he never bothered to imagine once she was no longer part of his plans. Yet somewhere beyond his attention, Eva had continued living. Growing. Evolving. Wielding a life entirely separate from him. The realization carried an uncomfortable weight. Near the front of the ballroom, a wedding planner approached Alexander briefly and thanked him for accommodating the schedule adjustment. Ethan noticed the interaction immediately. Alexander simply smiled and assured her everything was fine. No arrogance. No reminder that he owned the property. No need to demonstrate authority. The planner walked away visibly relieved. Ava watched the exchange with a knowing expression. As though this kind of interaction happened often. Ethan looked around the ballroom one final time. Suddenly every strange detail from earlier made sense. The respect from staff. The attention from executives. The nervous energy among management. The private arrivals. The quiet deference. None of it had been accidental. The entire evening had been revealing clues. And now the answer stood plainly in front of him. What Ethan still did not know was the one thing that mattered most. How had a woman he once underestimated become the person standing beside a man the entire room respected? The ceremony ended beneath a sky filled with stars, and one by one the guests began moving toward the reception hall. Music returned. Conversations resumed. Glasses were raised. Yet for Ethan, the evening no longer felt the same. The world he thought he understood had quietly shifted beneath his feet. He stood near the terrace overlooking the mountains, watching the lights of the resort glow against the desert darkness. From there, he could see Eva and Alexander speaking with several guests near the ballroom entrance. The scene was simple. No grand announcements. No attempts to impress anyone. Used two people moving comfortably through a room that respected them. Ethan remembered the version of success he once chased so relentlessly. Bigger contracts. Better connections. More recognition. He had spent years believing those things would eventually bring fulfillment. Yet standing there now, he realized the person who seemed most at peace was not the one trying hardest to prove anything. It was Eva. The woman he once assumed would struggle without him. The woman he once underestimated. Madison stepped beside him and followed his gaze. Neither spoke for a moment. There was nothing left to say. Across the ballroom, a group of executives approached Alexander. He greeted them warmly before introducing Eva into the conversation. Not as an afterthought. Not as someone standing beside him. As an equal. Ethan noticed the respect in their reactions immediately. They listened when she spoke. They valued her presence. The realization settled heavily in his chest. For years, he believed success had elevated him beyond the life he left behind. Tonight revealed something entirely different. Eva had never needed to become someone else to find happiness. She had simply become more of herself. A few minutes later, Alexander extended his hand toward her. She smiled and accepted it. Together they began walking toward the private terrace beyond the reception hall. Neither looked back. Neither searched for approval. Neither seemed interested in who was watching. They simply moved forward. Ethan watched until they disappeared through the doorway. Then he looked out across the dark mountains stretching beyond the resort. For the first time in years, he stopped comparing his life to someone else's. Because the truth had become impossible to ignore. He had not lost Eva to another man. He had lost her the moment he stopped seeing her value. Everything that happened afterward was simply the consequence of that choice. Somewhere beyond the music and laughter, Eva was living a life she built through resilience, dignity, and quiet determination. She had not returned to prove anyone wrong. She had not arrived seeking revenge. She had arrived as living proof that the people who rise after heartbreak do not need to announce their victory. Their happiness speaks for itself. And as the lights of Sterling Ridge shimmered beneath the Arizona night sky, one truth remained. She did not win him back. She won herself.